Sometime around 2900 BCE, a great flood destroyed the world. Or at least, that is what the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia believed, and they wrote it down in careful detail on clay tablets that survived for nearly 5,000 years before archaeologists dug them out of the ground in what is now southern Iraq. The Sumerian flood story describes a man named Ziusudra, chosen by the gods to survive the destruction of humanity. He built a vessel. He loaded it with animals and his family. The flood came, covering the earth for 7 days and 7 nights. When it receded, Ziusudra's vessel came to rest on a mountain, and he offered sacrifices to the gods who had saved him. You recognize this story. Of course you do. You grew up with a version of it. But here is what you may not have fully considered. The Sumerian version of this story predates the biblical version of Noah's Ark by at least 1,000 years, and possibly much more. And neither the Sumerians nor the Hebrews were alone in telling it. Across the ancient world, in cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of years, the same story appears with a consistency that has puzzled scholars for over 2 centuries. In the Hindu tradition, a man named Manu is warned by a fish that a great flood is coming. He builds a boat, survives the flood, and repopulates the earth. In ancient Greece, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus, their vessel coming to rest on Mount Parnassus. In Mesoamerica, the Maya describe multiple world destructions by water in the Popol Vuh. The Aztec tradition describes 4 previous worlds, each destroyed, one of them by flood. Indigenous cultures across North America, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Oceania carry flood traditions of extraordinary detail and consistency. By the most conservative scholarly count, there are over 200 independent flood myths from cultures around the world. Some researchers put the number higher, and the flood is only the beginning, because when you look carefully at the full range of ancient mythological traditions, the parallels go much deeper and much stranger than a single shared story about water. They suggest that something happened in deep human prehistory that left a mark on the collective imagination of our entire species, a mark so deep that it survived the dissolution of languages, the collapse of civilizations, and the migration of peoples across every continent on Earth. Today we are going to go through the evidence, what the myths actually say, where they appear, how scholars have tried to explain them, and what the most current research suggests about why the same fears keep surfacing in cultures that should have had no way to share them. The flood myth is the most widely distributed narrative in human cultural history, and its distribution is genuinely global in a way that defies easy explanation through cultural contact or diffusion. The scholarly study of comparative flood mythology began in earnest in the 19th century, when Assyriologist George Smith of the British Museum translated the Epic of Gilgamesh from Assyrian clay tablets in 1872 and identified within it a flood narrative, the story of Utnapishtim, that bore unmistakable structural similarities to the biblical story of Noah. The discovery caused a sensation in Victorian England, where it was simultaneously celebrated as confirmation of biblical history and treated with deep unease by those who recognized that if the Babylonian story predated the biblical one, the implications for biblical authority were significant. But what Smith's discovery actually inaugurated was a century and a half of comparative mythology research that has progressively mapped the flood tradition across the world, and the results are more remarkable than even Smith could have anticipated. The core structural elements of the flood myth appear with striking consistency across cultures that cannot have borrowed from each other. A divine warning to a specific individual, a vessel of salvation, the survival of a chosen few and the destruction of the rest, a mountain as the resting place of the vessel, a sacrifice offered after the waters recede, a covenant or promise from the divine powers that the destruction will not happen again. These elements appear in the Gilgamesh epic of Mesopotamia, dating to at least 2100 BC in written form but almost certainly older in oral tradition. They appear in the Hindu Shatapatha Brahmana's account of Manu and the fish, which scholars date to approximately 800 BC in written form but again drawing on older tradition. They appear in Plato's account of Deucalion, which Plato himself frames as an ancient tradition. They appear in the flood accounts of the Yoruba people of West Africa, the Lolo people of China, the Maori of New Zealand, the Algonquin of North America, and the Canari of Ecuador, among many others. The question that this distribution poses is one that mythology scholars have been wrestling with for generations. What explains it? There are, broadly speaking, three categories of explanation that serious researchers have advanced, and each of them illuminates a different dimension of what the flood myth might mean. The first explanation is diffusion, the idea that the flood myth originated in one place and spread outward through cultural contact, trade, and migration. This explanation works well for the obvious connections. The Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew flood stories are clearly related to each other, and the connections between them are well documented through archaeological and textual evidence. The Gilgamesh flood account and the Noah account share so many specific details: the birds sent out to find land, the resting on a mountain, the sacrifice after the flood, that direct literary borrowing is virtually certain. But diffusion has real limits as an explanation for the global distribution. The flood myths of Mesoamerica were documented by Spanish missionaries in the 16th century, before those missionaries had translated Genesis into indigenous languages, which means the Aztec and Maya flood traditions cannot have been borrowed from the Hebrew Bible. The flood traditions of Australian Aboriginal peoples, who had been isolated from the rest of the world for at least 40,000 years before European contact, appear in some oral traditions that researchers believe may encode genuinely ancient memories. Diffusion cannot stretch far enough to explain all of it. The second explanation is geological, the idea that flood myths preserve memories of real catastrophic flood events that ancient peoples actually experienced. This explanation has gained significant scientific support in recent decades. Geologist William Ryan and oceanographer Walter Pittman published research in 1998 arguing that a catastrophic flood of the Black Sea Basin occurred approximately 7,600 years ago, when rising post-glacial sea levels in the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus and flooded what had been a freshwater lake, submerging an enormous area of inhabited coastal land in a matter of months. Ryan and Pittman proposed that this event, real, geologically documented, affecting a large population, might have been the historical kernel of the Near Eastern flood traditions. More broadly, the end of the last ice age, which occurred between approximately 18,000 and 7,000 years ago, involved the flooding of enormous areas of coastal land as global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters. Every coastal culture in the world would have experienced some version of this, the gradual but relentless loss of land to the sea over generations, occasionally punctuated by more dramatic events. It is entirely plausible that memories of this flooding, encoded in oral tradition and passed down over thousands of years, formed the substrate of flood myths across the globe. The third explanation is psychological, the idea proposed most influentially by the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung that certain narrative patterns, which he called archetypes, are embedded in what he called the collective unconscious of humanity, a layer of shared psychological structure that all humans carry regardless of their cultural background. On this view, the flood myth is not a memory of a specific event or a borrowed story, but an expression of a universal psychological pattern, the experience of destruction and renewal, of the world ending and beginning again, that arises independently in every culture because it reflects something fundamental about how human minds process catastrophic experience. No single one of these explanations is adequate on its own. The most intellectually honest position, and the one that most contemporary researchers in comparative mythology have settled into, is that the flood myth is probably overdetermined. It exists in so many cultures for so many different reasons simultaneously, and the specific form it takes in each culture reflects a complex mixture of historical memory, psychological archetype, and cultural borrowing that cannot be cleanly disentangled. But here is what makes this genuinely strange, and what most discussions of flood myths never get to. The flood is just one of the patterns. When you step back and look at the full range of ancient mythological traditions from cultures around the world, you find the same structural elements appearing again and again in stories that have nothing to do with water. And some of those patterns are harder to explain than the flood, because they are stranger, more specific, and more consistent across cultures that had even less reason to share them. Of all the recurring figures in world mythology, the serpent is perhaps the most universally significant and the most consistently ambiguous. In virtually every ancient culture that has left a mythological record, the serpent appears as a figure of enormous power, associated simultaneously with creation and destruction, with wisdom and danger, with the earth and the underworld and the sky. In the Hebrew tradition, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is the agent of humanity's fall from a state of innocence. But in the same tradition, Moses lifts a bronze serpent on a pole in the wilderness that heals the Israelites who look upon it, a symbol of healing power so potent that it was preserved in the temple in Jerusalem for centuries. In ancient Mesopotamia, the god Ninjashida was depicted as a serpent or associated with serpents, and the caduceus, the staff entwined with two serpents that today is a symbol of medicine, has its origins in Mesopotamian iconography. In ancient Egypt, the cobra goddess Wadjet was one of the oldest and most powerful divine figures, and the uraeus, the rearing cobra, decorated the crowns of pharaohs as a symbol of divine authority and protective power. Cross the world to Mesoamerica, and the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec tradition, Kukulkan in the Maya, is one of the most important divine figures in the entire religious system. A creator god, a god of wind and learning and the morning star, depicted as a serpent covered with the feathers of the Quetzal bird. The feathered serpent combines two of the most powerful animals in Mesoamerican symbolism, the snake of the earth and the bird of the sky, into a single being that transcends the boundary between the terrestrial and the celestial. In Hindu mythology, the Nagas are a class of semi-divine serpent beings of immense power and ambiguity, sometimes beneficent protectors, sometimes dangerous forces that must be propitiated. The great serpent Shisha serves as the cosmic bed on which the god Vishnu rests between the cycles of creation. In ancient China, the dragon, which in Chinese tradition is fundamentally a serpentine being, not the winged fire-breathing creature of European imagination, is a symbol of imperial power, cosmic order, and the life-giving force of water and rain. In the Aboriginal traditions of Australia, the rainbow serpent is one of the most ancient and widespread mythological figures in the entire cultural record, a creator being of vast power associated with water, fertility, and the establishment of the laws by which human communities must live. Some researchers have argued that the rainbow serpent tradition may be among the oldest continuously maintained mythological traditions in the world, potentially tens of thousands of years old. The anthropologist Joseph Campbell, whose 4-volume comparative mythology study, The Masks of God, remains one of the most ambitious attempts to map the patterns of world mythology, argued that the serpent's universal significance reflects its role as a symbol of the life force itself, of the cycling, renewing, shedding skin energy of life that ancient peoples observed in the natural world and projected onto a divine plane. The serpent sheds its skin and is reborn. It lives underground and emerges into the world of the living. It is both predator and prey, both poison and cure. It embodies the ambiguity of existence in a form that is visually and viscerally powerful across all human cultures. Whether Campbell's explanation is fully adequate is debated, but the fact that requires explanation, the near-universal significance of the serpent in ancient religious traditions, is not. Two more mythological patterns appear with a consistency across world cultures that demands attention: the figure of the winged divine being, a creator or messenger associated with the sky, and the world tree, the cosmic axis that connects the underworld, the earth, and the heavens. Winged divine figures appear in the iconography and mythology of virtually every ancient culture. In Mesopotamia, The god Ashur was depicted with wings, as were the Anunnaki in certain representations. In Egypt, the god Horus was a falcon. His eyes were the sun and the moon, and the pharaoh was identified with Horus in his living form and with Osiris after death. The winged sun disk, a symbol of divine power associated with the sun god Ra and later with the Assyrian god Ashur, spread across the ancient Near East and appears in monuments from Egypt to Persia. In ancient Greece, the messenger of the gods, Hermes, wore winged sandals and a winged helmet. The goddess Nike was depicted with wings. The muses were sometimes shown with wings. In Mesoamerica, as we have seen, the feathered serpent combined serpentine and avian attributes in a single divine figure of supreme importance. In the Andean traditions, the condor, the largest flying bird in the Americas, was associated with the upper world and with divine power. In the Norse tradition, the god Odin could transform into an eagle. The eagle sat at the top of the world tree Yggdrasil. The Valkyries rode through the sky as crow-like figures collecting the souls of the dead. The world tree itself, the cosmic axis connecting the three realms of underworld, earth, and sky, appears with remarkable consistency across cultures separated by enormous distances. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil is the great ash tree at the center of the cosmos, its roots reaching into the realm of the dead and its branches touching the realm of the gods. In Hindu cosmology, the cosmic mountain Meru serves a similar function as the axis of the universe, with the heavens above and the underworld below. In Mesoamerican mythology, the Ceiba tree was the world tree connecting the three realms of Maya cosmology. In ancient Mesopotamia, a sacred tree appears repeatedly in cylinder seal iconography as a cosmic symbol. In Siberian shamanic traditions, the shaman's drum was often made from the wood of a cosmic tree, and the shaman's journey to the spirit world was conceptualized as a journey up or down the world tree. The anthropologist Mircea Eliade, who devoted much of his scholarly career to studying shamanism and its connections to world mythology, argued that the world tree and the axis mundi, the cosmic center, represent a universal human need to orient oneself in the cosmos, to find a fixed point from which to understand the structure of reality. The specifics vary, ash tree, mountain, Ceiba, but the underlying structure is the same, a vertical axis connecting the realms above and below, with humanity occupying the middle space between them. Now, here is the question that all of this evidence eventually forces. We have flood myths on every continent. We have serpent figures of cosmic significance in every ancient tradition. We have winged creators and world trees from Scandinavia to Mesoamerica. Three explanations exist: cultural diffusion, geological memory, and universal psychology. But none of them fully satisfies. So let me tell you about a fourth possibility that researchers have only recently begun to take seriously, and that changes how you look at all of it. In 2010, a team of researchers led by Julien Dihouy at the CNRS in Paris began applying phylogenetic analysis, the same mathematical techniques used to reconstruct evolutionary trees in biology, to world mythology. The idea was radical. If myths, like genes, are transmitted from one generation to the next and undergo modification over time, then the same statistical methods used to trace the evolutionary history of species should, in principle, be able to reconstruct the history of myths. Dewey's team applied this method to the Polyphemus myth, the story of a hero who blinds a one-eyed giant, and found that the statistical analysis produced a family tree of this myth that closely matched the known patterns of human migration out of Africa. The myth appeared to have originated in Africa before the dispersal of modern humans to the rest of the world, approximately 70,000 years ago, and to have traveled with human populations as they migrated to Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas. If the analysis is correct, some versions of the Polyphemus story are over 70,000 years old. Dewey subsequently applied the same methods to flood myths, and the results suggested a similarly deep origin, with some flood traditions potentially tracing back to the period before the dispersal of modern humans from Africa, or to the very earliest phases of that dispersal. This would mean that the flood myth is not merely old. It is ancient in a way that dwarfs everything we typically mean by the word ancient. It would mean that some version of the story was being told before Homo sapiens had reached Europe, before the agricultural revolution, before the first cities, before writing, before history as we conventionally understand it. This hypothesis, sometimes called the deep mythology hypothesis, is controversial and not yet accepted as consensus. The application of phylogenetic methods to cultural data raises genuine methodological questions, and Dehui's analyses have been both supported and challenged by subsequent researchers. But the direction of travel in the field is clear. The evidence increasingly suggests that some mythological traditions are far older than the civilizations that preserve them, and that they encode information about human experience that predates anything in the written record. The Australian evidence is particularly striking in this context. Researchers, including Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast, have spent years documenting Aboriginal oral traditions that appear to encode accurate memories of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, specific descriptions of coastlines, islands, and geographical features that are now underwater, submerged between 7,000 and 18,000 years ago. Nunn argues that some of these oral traditions have maintained accurate geographical information for up to 10,000 years, which would make them the oldest accurately preserved historical records in human existence, transmitted entirely through storytelling across hundreds of generations. If oral traditions can preserve accurate geographical information for 10,000 years, what else might they preserve? What fears, what catastrophes, what cosmic understandings might be encoded in the myths that all human cultures share, not because they borrowed from each other, but because they carried the same memories forward from a time before the separation of peoples, a time when the ancestors of all of us faced the same world and told the same stories about it. The scholarly consensus on world mythology has shifted significantly in the past 2 decades, and it is worth stating clearly where that consensus currently stands, because popular accounts of this topic often either overstate the case for a single unified source of all mythology or dismiss the parallels as coincidence. Neither extreme is supported by the evidence. What the evidence does support is this: some mythological parallels between distant cultures are the result of direct borrowing through contact, trade, and migration. This is well established for the connections between Near Eastern, Mediterranean, and South Asian mythological traditions, which were in contact for millennia through the trade networks of the ancient world. The flood story, the creation myth, the descent to the underworld. These narrative patterns moved along trade routes and through the corridors of ancient empires the same way that bronze technology and writing systems moved. Some mythological parallels are the result of independent responses to universal human experiences, the experience of natural disaster, of death, of the apparent motion of the sun and stars, of the power of animals that can kill or heal. Every culture that observes serpents will notice that they shed their skin. Every culture that watches the night sky will notice the apparent movement of the stars. Every culture that lives near water will know the danger of flooding. These shared experiences produce shared symbolic responses that appear similar across cultures without any direct connection between them. And some mythological parallels, and this is where the evidence is newest and most challenging, appear to reflect genuine deep historical memory, traditions that have preserved information about real events, real landscapes, and real experiences from a period of human history that predates writing, predates cities, and in some cases predates the separation of human populations that we now think of as distinct cultures. The work of Dehui on mythological phylogenetics and of Nunn on Australian oral traditions preserving memories of sea level rise suggests that the oral tradition is a far more robust and accurate vehicle for long-term information transmission than scholars have historically assumed. What this means, in practice, is that when you encounter a flood myth in a culture on the other side of the world from the one you grew up in, you are not necessarily looking at coincidence, and you are not necessarily looking at borrowing. You may be looking at a window into a shared human past, a past that existed before the histories we have written, before the civilizations we have excavated, in the deep time when all of our ancestors faced the same world and tried to make sense of it with stories that have, in some form, survived to the present day. The same story appears everywhere, not because every culture on Earth read the same book, and not because the human imagination is too limited to invent different stories, but because the human experience that generates these stories is genuinely shared. We all live on a planet that floods. We all encounter serpents. We all look up at a sky populated by flying creatures and wonder what it would be like to reach it. We all need to orient ourselves in a cosmos that is vast and often hostile, to find the center that holds the world together, to understand why the world is the way it is and not some other way. But the research of the past 20 years suggests something more specific and more haunting than universal human experience. It suggests that some of what we find in the myths is not just a response to the present world but a memory of specific events, floods that really happened, landscapes that are now underwater, catastrophes that actually occurred, preserved in the oral tradition of human cultures across hundreds of generations, across tens of thousands of years, arriving in our present moment still recognizable as stories about things that were real. The Sumerian scribe who wrote down the story of Ziusudra and the Great Flood was not inventing something. He was writing down something that had already been told for longer than his civilization had existed, something that came to him from a past so deep that it predates everything we typically mean by history, and that is still recognizable to you today because you carry the same deep inheritance that he carried, the same long memory of a world that was once different and that changed in ways people could not explain except by telling stories about it. We do not know exactly what happened. We do not know precisely which real events gave rise to which specific myths, or how far back the deepest traditions reach, or what was lost in the vast silence between the first telling and the first writing. The honest answer is that we are still working it out, that the tools of phylogenetic mythology and sea-level archaeology and comparative oral tradition are still young, and that the full picture is not yet visible. But we know enough to say this: the same story everywhere is not an accident. It is a signal, and we are still learning to read it. This has been the Hidden History Vault. The vault is never truly empty.